I finally stopped logging in as guest and registered with Pixelborn. Unfortunately, this reset all my decks and ladder progress, so I guess I figured it'd be a good time to just restart the leaderboard grind and maybe make a series out of it. I plan on sticking with Emerald Amber Aggro, which isn't a very fancy deck, but I personally think it's one of the top 3 decks in the metagame, so let's jump in and see how we do. I'll be sticking with the same list I've always played, though I do have some slight changes in mind, but we'll see later on if I stick with the deck or pick up something else if it gets boring. I'll be doing post-game commentary for all the games I played so we can get through it quickly without much downtime. First game, we get to go first, which is super important for this deck, and probably for any decks in general. Cheshire Cat is my only 3-drop creature in this deck. I might add some Mickey Mouse or something in the future to fix that, but I like keeping Cheshire Cat so I can try and get a turn 1, 2, and 3 drop. I also kept Hans, which seems a little greedy. I think in retrospect, I'd just keep a Stitch and a Cheshire Cat and draw 5 cards. Rapunzel is usually not a good card to keep early on, especially when you're going first, since you're going to be on the offensive and not really challenging opponents' creatures much. We don't find a 2-drop, but this hand is okay. I ink a Duke and play a Stitch. Duke is just a worse version of Stitch since you can shift a Rockstar Stitch later on. My opponent inks a Robin Hood and passes, which is a good sign that he doesn't have a turn 1 play. I draw a second Mad Hatter and ink it after questing to play another Stitch. Since he didn't have a turn 1 drop, I want to go as aggressive as possible with quests. My opponent inks Captain Hook, so now we know he's playing some sort of blue steel deck, and he drops a Grandma Tala, which is going to be pretty useless against 2 Stitches. On my turn, I draw a Kuzco and quest. I don't need 2 Hans since I want to be going Hans turn 4, Kuzco and Hatter turn 5 and 6, so I ink him and play my Cheshire Cat. My opponent inks another Captain Hook and quests. He's going to fall pretty far behind, so it might be worth considering to sacrifice the Grandma Tala into a Stitch just to pick up an extra ink. He then smashes my cat, which I'm fine with because I'm about to drop Hans, and that also means he doesn't have a character play this turn. I draw a Stitch, I quest, and I drop Hans after inking my Stitch. I just need to draw 1 more ink card so I can set up a Hatter and Kuzco and hopefully finish my opponent off like that. My opponent quests again, inks a Maleficent and drops a Bell, so now we have a better idea of what he's playing, but I think his deck is just too far behind in tempo. Using Bell's ability, he inks once again this turn, this time a Hercules. We quest for 5, ink our Be Our Guest, and then I think Kuzco is the play here since his deck could have some targeted removal like Let It Go, Fire the Cannons, or even an accelerated Hades from Double Ink Bell. And Kuzco will get around all of these cards. My opponent gets rid of a Stitch with his Bell, quests, and inks, and drops a Donald Duck in bodyguard mode. We're still not exactly sure what kind of deck this is. I draw a Rockstar Stitch, and if I shift it onto my small Stitch, I can get in an extra 2 lore points, and since blue steel doesn't run mass removal like Be Prepared, we don't need to worry about overcommitting. We shift the Stitch and swing in for 9, leaving us 1 lore away from victory. My opponent can't find an answer to the board and simply concedes shortly after. 1-0 start to our ladder grind. Let's go to game 2. We get to go first again, which is great. We see a Flynn Rider and Duke for potential turn 1 and 2 plays. And we even have a Cheshire Cat for turn 3. We're going to keep those 3 and dump the rest, trying to improve to a Lilo draw. And again, Rapunzel's not too great to keep since we're going to be on the offensive going first. We do get our ideal Lilo on our mulligan, and the only improvement would really be getting a Simba to protect her in case our opponent drops a defensive turn 1 creature. But this starting hand is basically going to be top 5% of hands you can start with. I ink Be Our Guest and play Lilo and pass. Inking Duke here since we have a Stitch is also fine. Our opponent inks a Scepter and plays Develop Your Brain. Seems like he might be playing an item-based deck, but he didn't drop a creature on turn 1, so we're a pretty big favorite to win this game. We ink our Duke, drop our Flynn Rider, and quest and pass the turn. Our opponent inks an Eye of the Fates, so he's almost definitely playing some item deck, probably with Tamatoa, which is a kind of slow deck, so we should win this matchup, especially going first most of the time. He drops a Cauldron, so he's playing blue-purple. He really needed to drop a creature on turn 2, so it's not looking good for him facing my most aggressive start. On my turn, I quest and decide to ink my Stitch and play Cheshire Cat. Alternatively, I could play Stitch and Lilo for an extra lore threat, but I kinda liked Cheshire Cat's ability to always trade 1-for-1 in challenges against potential rush cards like Rafiki or Zeus. My opponent inks a Tamatoa and finally plays his first creature, Isma. On my turn, I draw a Simba, which makes my decision a little interesting. I can quest this turn to get to 12 lore. Originally, I was planning on dropping a Rapunzel on turn 4, but then he could trade his Isma for my Lilo on his turn, and I'd have 6 lore on board. But if I play Lilo and Simba in guard mode, Simba would absorb his Isma challenge, and then I could actually have 8 lore threat on board for a turn 5 win. I don't think item decks usually play rush cards like Rafiki or Zeus, and it doesn't run mass removal, so I decided the turn 5 win was too juicy to pass up, and I went with Simba and Lilo. I ink the Tink and pass my turn. My opponent can't find a solution to my Simba, and the threat of 8 quest lore the following turn, so he simply concedes. In theory, with a bunch of uncontested Lilo and Maleficent drops, a deck could win on turn 4, but that's never really gonna happen against a reasonable deck or opponent, so a turn 5 win is effectively the fastest you can win in this game. So that's pretty sick that I got one on my second game on ladder. On to game 3. We go second this game, which makes us sad considering Lilo and Flynn Rider are the first 2 cards we see. We even get a Simba. We're gonna keep these 3 cards. We'll play Flynn or Simba on turn 2 depending on what our opponents do, and probably ink the other. We mulligan into a Cheshire Cat, which is nice for our turn 3 setup. Our opponent inks an Aladdin turn 1 and passes. This means he almost certainly has a turn 2 creature drop. I'm not sure which deck runs green Aladdin, maybe he's playing a red-green Aladdin deck. I of course play Lilo after inking Be Our Guest and pass turn. My opponent inks Tinkerbell and drops Flynn Rider, so looks like he's playing some sort of aggro green deck. On my turn, I swing in with Lilo and ink Rapunzel into Bodyguard Simba to protect my Lilo for another turn from Flynn Rider, and I pass. My opponent inks Mickey, so now we should realize he's playing some sort of red-green aggro, maybe evasion deck with Aladdin. He drops Cheshire Cat and quests with Flynn. On my turn, I quest and I decide to remove his Flynn with my Simba, and I pitch the Stitch that I just drew. Then I ink my Flynn Rider to drop my own Cheshire Cat and pass. My opponent inks a green Aladdin and drops a red Aladdin. This will set him up for a turn 5 shifted heroic outlaw Aladdin, which if he plays, I think I'll just lose the game. The card is pretty insane in terms of racing to 20 lore. He then sings out a sudden chill with his Cheshire Cat, making me discard something, and I find that a really weird card to be in this deck. I generally don't think discard decks are very good. I go ahead and get rid of Maximus, although maybe I should have kept it to deal with the 5/5 body of a potential heroic Aladdin. On my turn, I decided to put 2 damage onto his Cheshire Cat with my Simba, which I don't think was the right play. I'm pretty far ahead lore-wise, so I think I need to just keep squeezing in every point of lore I can quest. I ink a Rapunzel to play a Rapunzel, which draws me a card off of my 1 damage on my Simba. Then I pass my turn. My opponent inks a sudden chill on his turn, and now I hold my breath, ready to die to a shifted Aladdin. But luckily for me, he only has a Mad Hatter to play. Thank God. He quests and passes. On my turn, I go ahead and quest with all my characters this time. I just want to finish off the game as soon as possible before he draws into an Aladdin. I nuke my Duke and play my Mad Hatter, threatening to win the game next turn. My opponent can't find anything else, and he plays a Genie. He tries trading a couple characters into my Simba, but after realizing he doesn't have enough to stop me from getting to 20 lore, he concedes. (3-0), let's keep it going. Game 4, we go first again, which is nice. We're gonna keep the Simba here and hope for a 1-drop Lilo and just get rid of everything else to have the highest chance of getting that Lilo. We don't get the Lilo, but at least we get a 1-drop Stitch, and we have the turn 3 Cheshire Cat play as well. Turn 1, we don't need 2 Flynns, so we ink 1 and play Stitch and pass. My opponent inks Robin Hood and passes. It's always nice to see a no turn 1 drop from our opponent when we play first. We draw a Lilo, which is pretty annoying to see. We want to make the most use of our ink, so we just ink Tinkerbell and play Flynn Rider after questing and pass. My opponent inks a Maui and plays a Gaston, so now we know he's playing some sort of blue-red deck. His Gaston's going to kill our Flynn Rider next turn and survive, so on my turn, instead of playing Cheshire Cat, I ink it to play Simba to protect my rider, as well as be able to trade with Gaston. Since I have an extra ink, I go ahead and play Lilo as well. My opponent inks Mickey and plays an Aladdin. His Gaston is forced to trade with my Simba. On my turn, I quest and ink a Rapunzel to play Rapunzel. No use in trying to save it for card draws. We need to apply pressure as fast as possible before he can get a heroic Aladdin out. He inks another Mickey and drops Gaston and Grandma Tala. He gets rid of my Flynn Rider with his Aladdin and he passes back to us. We need to start going all in here to try and end the game as soon as possible. So here on my turn, I could try and get rid of his Aladdin. I'd probably trade my Lilo for Aladdin and get to 11 lore from questing. But I think if he had an Aladdin in hand, he wouldn't exert his Aladdin last turn and risk losing it. So I decide to just make a read and go all in questing and playing the rest of my hand. This way I can get to 13 lore and have 9 lore threats on board. And if he trades perfectly, which is his Tala for my Lilo and his Gaston for my Rapunzel, I'll still have 5 lore on the board, giving myself 1 or 2 more turns to wrap up the game. He'll be left with 2 characters against my 3, and I think I should have barely enough. Of course, none of this will matter if he drops an Aladdin next turn, where I would just lose. He uses his 5 ink and drops an Aurora. Thank God again for no Aladdin. He trades Tala for my Lilo and trades Aladdin for my Stitch, even though I think he should have traded for the Rapunzel to prevent 1 extra lore point. I end up being wrong because I draw into a Rockstar Stitch, which I could have shifted and won the game immediately had he not killed off my small Stitch. So I guess it turns out that my opponent is a genius. I quest for 6 lore and just pass, and it's up to my opponent now to find an answer. He inks a Pongo up to 7 and is so excited to play a Be Prepared, he forgets to quest with Aurora first. The game is probably more than over though, as long as I draw any creature and as long as he doesn't draw an immediate answer. My only dead draws left in the deck are my 2 copies of Mother Knows Best, 2 Genies, and 1 Stitch. So when I draw a Hades, the game is all but over. I grab a Rapunzel just for the extra toughness, and when he plays an Aurora and passes, we swing in with the Hades and go 4-0. Game 5, we're going second. It's always sad to see Lilo in hand when going second. Still gonna keep her and Stitch as well as LeFou for a turn 2 drop. We don't mulligan into a great setup, but it's okay. My opponent inks Surfer Stitch first and passes. Now I don't really know what deck plays Surfer Stitch, as I don't think I've ever played against that card yet. Since I drew Flynn Rider, I ink LeFou and play my Lilo and pass. This is gonna turn out to be a mistake in the future. My opponent inks Be Our Guest and plays Simba, which is really annoying for my Lilo. We still don't know what his secondary color is. I go ahead and quest with Lilo. She's gonna die to Simba, but it's pointless to hold on to her. I play Flynn Rider and pass. Then I realize my turn 3 is going to be really rough as we have no turn 3 play. I realize now that inking LeFou may have been a mistake on my part because I don't have any cards to play on turn 3. My opponent inks Stitch and finally reveals his second color, which is Mickey Mouse, which in my opinion is one of the best blue cards in the game. He goes and gets rid of my Lilo, and now I pray for a turn 3 drop. Unfortunately, I don't draw anything that costs 3 or less, so I need to just ink and pass. Getting rid of LeFou or even Stitch with no turn 3 drop plan in sight, we definitely made a big mistake. I still quest and sacrifice my Flynn to a Simba, as going all in on quests is probably my only chance to win the game. My opponent quests and then inks Phil, and somehow he misses a 5 drop on his turn, so I'm thinking I might still have a chance. I ink Tinkerbell, play Hans, and pass. My opponent inks another Phil and drops a Robin Hood. Now this game is getting out of control. He can easily get rid of my Hans with his Robin Hood and gain complete control of the game. I get rid of his Simba with my Hans so I can draw some cards with my Rapunzel. I ink LeFou and drop a Stitch, preparing for a shifted Rockstar Stitch next turn. My opponent gets rid of my Hans with his Robin Hood, then draws the max cards off Rapunzel, healing his Robin. This is looking real bad for me now. He has ink advantage, board advantage, and card advantage, and we're even on lore. He plays Part of Your World, getting back another Robin Hood, and now it's my turn. Again, I'm going all in with my quest plan, and I shift my Stitch and swing in for 5 lore. Then I play Duke to draw a card off of Stitch's ability. I ink Tinkerbell and I pass my turn. My hand has some pretty good value characters, so I think there might still be hope for me, even though it might be small. My opponent gets rid of my Rockstar Stitch and plays Surfer Stitch, drawing even more cards. On my turn, I quest Rapunzel to 11 and trade my Duke for his Robin Hood. But I think it might have been better to stick with the plan of questing and just gotten in one more lore with the Duke. He has so many cards in his hand that I'm not going to be able to take back the game by making trades. The only chance I have is to try and race to 20 lore somehow and keep him on the defensive. Here I play a Maximus to protect my Rapunzel, but I think a better play would have been to play a Genie and return the Surfer Stitch to his hand. Sure, he gets to draw another 2 cards off of it, but at this point he has so much cards, it won't matter. He gets rid of my Maximus on his turn, and drops 3 more creatures, and it's passed back to me. I play a Cusco after questing and pass the turn. Had I played the Genie the turn before, I could have gone up to 15 lore, and I don't think he has very good answers for an evasion Genie. He gets rid of my Rapunzel, quests, and plays some stuff. And now it's back to me. I play Genie returning his Stitch, but at this point the game is over. I'm one turn too short, and he eventually overwhelms me after killing Cusco a couple turns later. So we ended this day's run at 4-1, and I think the last game that I lost was definitely a winnable game if I didn't make some mistakes. The first mistake was inking a 2-drop when I didn't have a play for turn 3, and also playing a Maximus instead of a Genie when I needed to apply maximum pressure. Losing the coin flip at the start definitely didn't help, as I could see myself winning this game if I'd gotten the extra 2 lore going first. Anyways, we'll continue this run later, but for now that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching.